I used to think quitting my job was the bravest thing I'd ever done. At the time, it felt like love in its purest form. I remember standing in the kitchen with the morning sun cutting across the counter, my coffee untouched, telling myself that sacrifices were what real marriages were built on. We'd been married 3 years, together almost 7. We met in our mid-20s, both hustling, both tired, both believing that if we just worked hard enough, life would eventually soften around us. When his company offered him a promotion that came with longer hours and more responsibility, I didn't hesitate. He looked exhausted all the time, shoulders tight, phone buzzing late into the night. I told him I'd handle things at home. I told him we'd be okay on one income for a while. I told him I believed in him. I worked in marketing for a mid-sized firm downtown. Nothing glamorous, but I was good at it. I liked the rhythm of deadlines, the casual jokes in the break room, the feeling of being needed somewhere outside my marriage. But I could see how stretched he was, how much pressure he carried. He'd come home late, loosen his tie, kiss my forehead, and collapse onto the couch with this faraway look in his eyes. When he said, "I don't know how I do this without you," it felt like a promise, like we were a team. So when I handed in my notice, my coworkers hugged me, wished me luck, told me I was lucky to have a husband climbing the ladder so fast. I smiled and nodded and ignored the tiny knot forming in my stomach. The first few weeks felt almost sweet. I woke up early to make his breakfast, packed his lunch, left little notes in his bag like we were newlyweds again. I cleaned the apartment until it smelled like lemon and soap, reorganized closets, finally framed the photos we'd been meaning to hang. I told myself this was just a season. He'd get settled, things would calm down, and maybe I'd find something part-time or freelance later. He kept saying it was temporary, that once this project wrapped up, he'd have more time. But the late nights didn't stop. If anything, they got later. At first, I didn't question it. Corporate jobs are like that, I told myself. He worked in finance, and year-end was brutal. There were deadlines, audits, client dinners. I'd text him around 7 asking when he thought he'd be home. Sometimes he'd respond quickly, apologetic, saying midnight, maybe later. Other times, hours would pass before my phone buzzed. I'd eat dinner alone, watch a show we used to watch together, eventually fall asleep with the TV on. I started waking up when he came in, the sound of keys in the door pulling me out of half-dreams. He'd slip into bed quietly, smelling faintly like cologne and something else I couldn't place. I'd pretend to be asleep because it felt easier than asking questions. There were little changes I noticed but brushed aside. He started showering as soon as he got home, even if it was 2 in the morning. His phone was always face down. He'd step into the hallway to take calls, his voice low, controlled. When I asked about his day, he'd give me broad summaries instead of details. "Same old stuff," he'd say. "Meetings, numbers. You wouldn't be interested." That stung more than I wanted to admit. I used to be the person he talked to about everything. Now I felt like a background character in my own marriage. I told myself not to be paranoid. I reminded myself that I'd chosen this, that trust was part of love. But when you're home all day, alone with your thoughts, they start to echo. The silence in the apartment felt heavier than it used to. I missed my coworkers, the casual human interaction, the feeling of having my own place to be. Some days I'd go hours without speaking to anyone. I'd scroll through social media and see photos of friends at work happy hours, inside jokes I was no longer part of. Meanwhile, my world had shrunk to errands, laundry, and waiting. One night, he came home close to 3. I was awake, sitting on the couch with a blanket around my shoulders. The TV was muted, some rerun thing I hadn't really watched. He looked startled to see me up. His smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Hey," he said softly. "Why are you still up?" I wanted to say, "Because I miss you, because I'm lonely, because this doesn't feel like a marriage anymore." Instead, I asked, "Everything okay at work?" He sighed, rubbing his face. "Yeah, just a long night. I told you this quarter was going to be rough." I nodded, even though something in his tone felt off, defensive, closed. He leaned down, kissed my head, and went to shower. I sat there listening to the water run, my chest tight. I told myself to stop overthinking. But that night, for the first time, a thought crossed my mind that I didn't want to have. The office wasn't the only place he stayed late. I didn't accuse him. I didn't snoop. Not yet. I tried harder instead. I cooked his favorite meals, wore the clothes he liked, suggested weekend getaways he always said he was too tired for. I laughed at his jokes even when they fell flat. I told myself that if I could just be more supportive, more understanding, whatever distance had crept in would disappear. But the more I leaned in, the more he seemed to pull away. He was always tired, always distracted. When we did have sex, it felt rushed, almost mechanical, like he was somewhere else the entire time. The The first real crack came on a random Tuesday afternoon. I was folding laundry when his work phone, the one he sometimes left at home, buzzed on the coffee table. I glanced at it without thinking, expecting a work email. Instead, it was a text preview from a name I didn't recognize. Just a first name, casual, familiar. The message said, "Last night was fun. We should do that again." My heart dropped so fast it felt physical. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. I told myself there had to be an explanation. A coworker, a client, something innocent taken out of context. But the wording sat wrong in my chest. Last night was fun. We should do that again. I didn't open the message. I didn't touch the phone. I just stood there, the neatly folded shirt slipping from my hands onto the floor. When he came home that night, I watched him closely. Every smile, every word felt loaded. He talked about work like usual, complained about deadlines, ate the dinner I'd made. I waited for him to mention anyone new, any late meeting that might explain the text. He didn't. After dinner, he picked up his work phone, checked it quickly, and slipped it into his pocket. Our eyes met for a split second, and something passed between us. Or maybe I imagined it. By the time we went to bed, my stomach was in knots. I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to his breathing, wondering how someone could be inches away from you and feel like a stranger. I didn't sleep much that night. By morning, I felt hollowed out, like something essential had been scooped from my chest. I still didn't know anything for sure. I still wanted to believe there was a reasonable explanation. But deep down, a quiet voice I couldn't silence was telling me that quitting my job hadn't just cost me my independence. It had left me blind in a life that was changing without my consent. And whatever was happening in that office, whatever kept him out so late, was already threatening to take more from me than I was prepared to lose.
The next few days passed in a blur, where everything looked normal from the outside, but felt completely wrong underneath. I smiled when he kissed me goodbye. I nodded when he talked about meetings and deadlines. I even laughed at a joke he made about his boss being clueless. But inside, I was replaying that text over and over, the words burning into my brain. Last night was fun. We should do that again. It didn't sound like a spreadsheet or a conference room or anything that belonged to his job. It sounded personal, intimate, familiar in a way that made my stomach twist. I tried to tell myself that jumping to conclusions would destroy us faster than any truth ever could. So instead of confronting him, I started paying attention. I noticed how often he checked his phone now, how quickly he locked the screen when I walked into the room. I noticed that his late nights followed a pattern. Tuesdays and Thursdays were the worst. Fridays he sometimes came home earlier, almost relaxed, like he'd already gotten what he needed somewhere else. On weekends, he was oddly distant, like he was recovering from something instead of enjoying time with me. Being home all day gave me too much time to think. I cleaned obsessively, scrubbing surfaces that were already spotless, trying to keep my hands busy so my mind wouldn't spiral. I went for long walks around the neighborhood, passing other couples, other lives, wondering how many of them were pretending the way I was. I hated that I'd become this version of myself, suspicious and quiet, afraid of asking the wrong question and hearing the wrong answer. I kept thinking about how different this would feel if I still had my job, if I still had somewhere to go, somewhere I mattered outside of him. One afternoon, I broke. I told myself I just wanted clarity. I waited until he was in the shower, the sound of the water pounding like a countdown in my ears. His work phone was on the nightstand. I stared at it for a long time before touching it, my heart racing like I was about to do something illegal. I hated that this was who I was now, but I hated not knowing more. The phone wasn't locked. That alone felt like a small betrayal, like he didn't even think I'd look. I opened the messages and scrolled until I found the name from the preview. There it was, a thread longer than I expected, longer than I was ready for. My hand shook as I read through it, my chest tightening with every line. They joked about inside things I didn't understand. They complained about work, about stress, about being tired, and woven between all of that were messages that left no room for innocence. Compliments, plans, references to nights they'd spent together when he told me he was stuck at the office. I sat down on the edge of the bed because my legs wouldn't hold me anymore. It felt like the room was tilting, like I was underwater. This wasn't a one-time mistake. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a relationship, ongoing, comfortable, and it had been happening while I was at home, folding his clothes, making his dinners, telling myself that love meant patience.
When he came out of the bathroom, towel around his waist, humming like it was any other day, I don't even remember standing up. I just remember the sound of my own voice, sharper than I recognized. "Who is she?" He froze, completely froze. For a second, we just stared at each other. The phone was still in my hand. His eyes flicked to it, then back to my face. I'd never seen him look like that before. Cornered, exposed. "It's not what you think," he said automatically, like he'd rehearsed it. I laughed, and the sound surprised me. It was hollow, almost hysterical. "That's funny, because I think you've been sleeping with someone else while I sit at home waiting for you." He ran a hand through his wet hair, pacing the room like an animal looking for an exit. "You went through my phone? That's what you're upset about." My voice cracked, and I hated that it did. "Not the fact that you've been lying to me?" He stopped pacing and finally looked at me. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this." That sentence felt like a slap. Not an apology, not a denial, just confirmation. I felt something inside me go quiet, like a switch flipping off. "How long?" I asked. He hesitated. "Too long. A few months." A few months. I thought about all the nights I'd eaten alone, all the mornings I'd packed his lunch, all the times I defended him in my own head when doubt crept in. "Is she from work?" He nodded. "She understands what the pressure is like. She's there. It just happened." I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw the phone at the wall. Instead, I felt this crushing weight settle over me. "So while I quit my job to support you, you found someone at work who understands you better than I do. That's not fair," he said quickly. "You offered to quit. I didn't ask you to." The words landed hard. I felt them lodge somewhere deep in my chest. "I did it for us," I said, "for our future." He looked away. I didn't think it would turn into this. That was the moment I realized how far apart we were. He talked like this was something that happened to him, not something he chose, like I was a bystander to my own marriage falling apart. I told him to leave that night. I didn't even think about where he'd go. I just needed him out of the apartment, out of my space, away from me. He argued at first, said we should talk, said he was sorry. But eventually he packed a bag and walked out, the door closing behind him with a finality that echoed through the apartment. The silence afterwards was unbearable. I wandered from room to room like a ghost, touching things we'd chosen together, memories suddenly tainted. I curled up on the couch and cried until my head hurt, until my chest ached, until there was nothing left but exhaustion. I felt stupid, used, furious at him and at myself. I kept thinking about how dependent I'd become without realizing it, how vulnerable I was now, financially and emotionally, because I'd trusted him completely. The next morning I woke up alone in our bed, the other side untouched. For a split second I forgot everything, reached out instinctively, and then it all came crashing back. My phone buzzed with a message from him asking if we could talk. I didn't respond. I didn't know what there was left to say. I didn't know if I wanted answers or closure, or just distance. All I knew was that the life I'd built around him had collapsed, and I was standing in the wreckage with no job, no routine, and no idea who I was without this marriage. As the day went on, anger started to replace shock. I replayed our conversation, every excuse, every deflection. I thought about her, the woman from his office, slipping into my place without ever stepping foot in it. I wondered if she knew about me, about the sacrifices I'd made, or if I'd just been an inconvenience, a detail he edited out of his late nights. By evening, my sadness had sharpened into something more focused. I wasn't ready to forgive. I wasn't even sure I wanted to save the marriage. But I knew one thing for sure. The story he told me about staying late at the office was only the beginning of what I was about to uncover. I didn't hear from him for a couple of days after he left. No calls, no texts, nothing. At first it felt like relief, like I could finally breathe. But then that relief twisted into a slow-burning kind of fear.
I had left my job, my stability, to be here, fully invested in a marriage that wasn't real anymore. I had nothing else. And the more I sat in the silence, the more I realized just how much of my life had been tied to him, how much of me had been tied to him. It was terrifying. I started keeping track of his patterns, even though he wasn't here. I went back through the little scraps of memory, Tuesdays and Thursdays, late nights that suddenly didn't make sense, the smell of cologne that wasn't his, the faint lipstick stain on a coffee cup I didn't recognize. I tried to write it off as paranoia at first, but every detail added up, painting a picture I didn't want to see. I remember the night I found a receipt in his coat pocket, a tiny coffee shop tucked into the corner of town, the same days he claimed to be in the office until midnight. I stared at it for minutes, turning it over in my hands, feeling that same hollow pit in my stomach. That weekend, curiosity got the better of me. I drove past his office building, not to spy, not exactly, just to see if the story matched up. The place was dark, empty, except for a few security lights, which made the lie he'd told feel even more grotesque. He hadn't been there at all. I parked a block away, sitting in my car, feeling like I was simultaneously a detective and a fool. I thought about confronting him again, about demanding the truth, but part of me dreaded it. Part of me was afraid that if I pulled on this thread, the whole fabric of what I thought was our life would unravel completely. Then Monday morning came, and with it, the text from her. I didn't want to see it, but my phone buzzed on the counter like a siren. It was from an unknown number, but the message started with his name and her own voice in plain words. "Thanks for last night. Can't wait to see you again." My hands went numb. My vision tunneled. I stared at the message, reading and rereading it, the letters swimming in front of my eyes. That's when it hit me fully. He wasn't just hiding something. He was leading a parallel life, one that I hadn't even imagined, and it had been happening while I'd given up everything for him. I knew I had to confront him again. I needed answers. Not apologies, not excuses, just raw, unfiltered truth. When he finally came home that evening, I was waiting. I didn't greet him. I didn't ask about work. I just held up my phone, and the look on his face said it all. He stumbled over his words, tried to spin it, to make it sound like nothing, like she was just someone at the office, and it was complicated. I felt my rage building, hotter, sharper, more dangerous than anything I'd felt before. "Complicated?" I said, my voice low, controlled, but shaking. "Do you understand what you've done? Do you understand how you've used me? How you've lied while I quit my job for us? While I've been waiting here like a fool?" He tried to interrupt, but I cut him off. "You think you can just slip into my life, into our home, like it's nothing? Do you even realize what this is? You're not just having an affair. You're destroying everything I built for us." He went pale, looking like a kid caught stealing candy. For the first time, I felt the power shift. The man who had held control over my life for so long, the man who had convinced me that quitting my job was love, was now exposed, raw and vulnerable. He left again that night, and I didn't call him. I didn't want to hear the rehearsed apologies, the excuses, the "I'm sorry" that had no weight behind it. Instead, I started digging into the life he'd built while pretending to be mine. I went through his phone. No, I mean really went through it, looking for patterns, evidence, anything that would show me just how deep the betrayal went. And I found it. Emails with her, lunch receipts, photos she had sent him, smiling in ways I had once thought were reserved for me. I found hotel bookings, a string of them, carefully dated on nights he claimed to be working late. It was surreal, almost cinematic, the way the truth sprawled out before me like a crime scene. My hands shook as I held the receipts, the phone, the notes. I kept asking myself, how could he do this? How could he live like this and still look me in the eye? And the answer was terrifyingly simple. He had compartmentalized me. I wasn't a partner anymore. I
was a placeholder. Someone to hold the home front while he chased excitement somewhere else.
But the deeper I went, the more I realized this wasn't just a phase, a mistake, or a fling. It was a pattern. He was living two lives, and I had been his unwitting alibi. One night, I sat at the kitchen table, phone in hand, staring at all the evidence. I thought about confronting him one last time, not with anger, not with tears, but with the truth laid bare. But I hesitated. I realized that no confrontation would change the past. No words could undo months of deception. I didn't even know if I wanted to repair anything. Part of me wanted to burn it all down, leave the apartment, the marriage, and the person I thought I knew behind. And yet, I was still tied to him in ways that scared me, emotionally, financially, morally. I remember sitting there, head in my hands, thinking about how love had become something so unrecognizable, how I had traded my independence for a fantasy, for a man who never really existed in the way I believed. The weight of it pressed on me, suffocating, relentless. I realized I had two choices: continue to be a ghost in my own life, haunted by what he had done, or start clawing my way back to myself, piece by piece. The problem was that doing either would be excruciating. There was no easy path, no tidy resolution. There was only the slow, painful unmasking of everything I had believed in. That night, I cried myself to sleep again, but differently. Not the hollow, helpless crying of the first weeks. This was a more determined grief, the kind that promises change, even if the steps forward are terrifying. I didn't know what the next day would bring. I didn't know how I'd face him, or if I'd face him at all. But I knew that my life, the one I had put on hold, the one he had shattered, was mine to reclaim. And that thought, though small, fragile, and flickering, was the first thing that felt real in weeks. After weeks of staying holed up in the apartment, obsessing over his patterns, tracing every lie, I decided I couldn't live like that anymore. The betrayal wasn't something I could ignore, and pretending it hadn't happened was like trying to breathe underwater. I needed air. I needed space. And more than anything, I needed to reclaim a version of myself that had been erased by years of trust and sacrifice. I started slowly, almost painfully. First, I updated my resume. I told myself it wasn't about getting a job immediately. It was about proving to myself that I could still exist outside him. Every word I typed reminded me that I still had skills, ambition, drive. Every line was a declaration that I wasn't defined by my marriage or his betrayal. I set up a LinkedIn account, applied to a few remote positions, and even reached out to some old colleagues. Each email I sent felt like a quiet rebellion, like I was taking tiny bites out of the prison he had built around me. I also set boundaries. I stopped answering his calls immediately, stopped opening his texts, stopped pretending that I could maintain a casual conversation. When he tried to explain, to apologize, to soften the situation with vague promises, I didn't engage. I realized he wasn't sorry for what he'd done. He was sorry he'd been caught. That distinction hit me like a punch. I couldn't allow him back into my life without a fundamental acknowledgement of the damage he'd caused, and I knew deep down he wasn't capable of that. I started seeing a therapist, someone I could speak to honestly, without filters. The first few sessions were messy. I cried, I screamed. I admitted the things I'd never told anyone, that I'd quit my job, that I'd given up pieces of myself, that I felt used, betrayed, and utterly invisible. Each session left me drained, but also lighter. The therapist helped me start untangling the knots inside my mind, the guilt, the shame, the anger, and put words to emotions I couldn't name before. I began to see that the betrayal wasn't my fault, that my choice to support him was made out of love, not weakness, and that his actions were his own. One evening, I walked past a boutique coffee shop I used to go to during my lunch breaks. It smelled like roasted beans and pastries, the kind of ordinary thing that had once made me feel alive. I sat at a table near the window, ordered a latte, and took out a notebook. I wrote down everything, every detail of the affair, every moment of doubt, every pang of loneliness I had endured. But this time, I wrote not as a victim, but as a witness, as someone reclaiming her own story. Writing became a ritual, a way to exorcise him from my mind and solidify my own presence in the world. As I rebuilt myself, I realized something unexpected.
I wasn't angry in the same raw, destructive way I had been. The fury was still there, simmering under the surface, but it had a shape now. It was focused. It wasn't just resentment toward him anymore. It was clarity about what I deserved, about who I was outside the shadow of his betrayal. I started going to friends again, reconnecting with people I had neglected, people who reminded me that life didn't have to revolve around a man who lied to me. I even rejoined a local fitness class, not because I was trying to fix myself, but because movement reminded me that my body and my mind were mine, and I could still inhabit them fully. Months passed. I found a part-time marketing gig at a small startup. It wasn't the same as my old job, but it was enough to remind me that I could function, thrive, and contribute outside my marriage. I felt myself smiling more, laughing more, even waking up earlier just because I wanted to, not because I had to prepare for someone else. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the apartment stopped feeling like a prison. It became mine again, a space where I could exist freely without constantly calculating his absence or presence. Eventually, he tried to come back. He called one night, hesitant, apologetic, trying to weave the same old story of stress and temptation. I listened, quietly, letting him speak. And then I told him the truth. I said I knew everything, the texts, the coffee shop, the receipts, the hotel stays. I said I knew the lies, the distance, the other life he had built while I was at home supporting him. And I told him, calmly, that there was no path forward for us, no reconciliation, no trying again. He argued, begged, even threatened. I didn't falter. I simply said, "You had your chance. I gave you my life, and you broke it. I'm done." It was liberating in a way I hadn't anticipated. The act of drawing a line in the sand, of declaring that I would no longer exist as a shadow in someone else's story, made me feel stronger, steadier. The betrayal still hurt. God did it still hurt, but it no longer defined me. It had happened, and I had survived. And surviving, I realized, wasn't just about enduring. It was about reclaiming my life, piece by piece, moment by moment. I moved out a few weeks later. Not far, still in the same city, still near my job, but far enough that I didn't have to hear the echoes of his voice in the apartment. Far enough that I could rebuild a home that was mine alone. I filled it with the things I liked, the art I wanted to see, the furniture I chose. I cooked my own meals, watched the shows I enjoyed, slept through the nights without tension twisting my chest. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living.
Over time, I realized that the person I had been when I quit my job, the one who believed in love as sacrifice, who believed that devotion meant giving everything without question, wasn't gone. She had been buried under betrayal and fear, yes, but she was still there. And now she was awake, stronger, wiser, and far more protective of herself than I had ever been. I still remembered the nights of loneliness, the moments of panic, the sting of seeing him with someone else. But I also remembered how I had risen, how I had reclaimed my identity, how I had turned pain into purpose. It's strange the way betrayal works. It doesn't just hurt you. It forces you to confront yourself in ways you never imagined. It forces you to ask questions about who you are, what you want, and what you will no longer tolerate. And I learned that the hardest truths often bring the most profound clarity. I didn't need him. I didn't need the fantasy of us. I needed myself. And finally, after months of grieving, questioning, and rebuilding, I had her back. I still think about the life I gave up, the years I invested, and the person I thought I was marrying. But now, when I do, I don't feel that hollow ache of betrayal as sharply. I feel the quiet, resolute strength of someone who survived deception and emerged whole. I know I'll never forget him or the affair, but I also know that the life I've rebuilt, one I chose entirely for myself, is worth more than anything I ever lost. I quit my job once for love, and I paid a high price. But I also learned that love without honesty is not worth keeping, and that your own life, your own identity, is the one thing no one else should ever control. It took betrayal, heartbreak, and months of clawing back, but I finally understand that the truest form of loyalty is to yourself. And in that, I found freedom.